Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder. They come quietly, in a hospital room where a child lies between life and death, and a hand from heaven gently touches his forehead. This is the story of Daniel, a little boy who had never heard the name Padre Pio, yet woke from a dream describing him in vivid detail and was suddenly healed. In a world full of questions, this one held only faith. If you're drawn to true Catholic spiritual encounters, the kind that leave you quietly wondering, then take a deep breath, subscribe to Fogman Stories, and walk with us through this quiet miracle. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Waiting Room of Silence. They say hospitals are where science meets suffering, but for me, it always felt like something more lingered there, something older than medicine, deeper than pain. Perhaps it was the quiet, the way silence hung in the air like breath not yet released, as if the building itself was holding a prayer it dared not speak aloud. Daniel was 8 years old the first time I noticed the shadows clinging to him. He was always a small boy, but cancer had turned him into something feather-light, a little frame wrapped in hospital linens, his cheeks sunken, his eyes too big for his face. He had once been so full of life, running through the garden barefoot, laughing at birds like they were telling him secrets. Now he barely spoke above a whisper, and even that cost him energy. It had been our 5th week in the oncology ward. The walls here were white, sterile, and humming with fluorescent light. Everything smelled of antiseptic and artificial lemon. Machines beeped in quiet rhythm beside every child, like the ticking of 1,000 fragile clocks. Angela, his mother, never left his side. She was the kind of woman who prayed more with her presence than her words. Not that she didn't speak to God, she did. Constantly, quietly, her rosary never left her hand. At night, I'd see her in the corner chair, her lips moving in time with the beads, whispering Hail Marys into the dark. Daniel's diagnosis had come quickly and cruelly, an aggressive lymphoma that spread like wildfire. The doctors had tried everything: chemo, radiation, experimental trials. Each round left him weaker than the last. And yet, Angela never stopped believing. I remember one night, early on, when I asked her how she managed to keep her faith. "It's not about understanding," she said, "it's about surrendering. Sometimes you just hold on to the hem of Christ's robe and don't let go." That night, Daniel had a fever that wouldn't break. His body trembled beneath his blanket like a leaf in the wind. Angela sat beside him, fingers tangled in her rosary. Eyes closed, I stepped out into the hallway, giving them space, and found myself staring at the crucifix that hung above the nurse's station. It was small and plain, the wood worn smooth by time, but in that moment, I thought I saw the eyes of Christ looking down, not with judgment, but with a sadness too heavy for words. The days blurred together. Mornings bled into afternoons, afternoons into a tired kind of evening that never truly darkened. Hospital time was strange like that. The world outside might have turned orange and gold with autumn, but inside, everything was stuck in a kind of eternal waiting. By the 3rd week, Daniel's vitals began to slip. The doctors gathered Angela and me into a small room and used words like diminishing response and prepare for comfort care. They tried to be gentle, but you could hear it in their voices. The hope was running out. Angela thanked them softly, then went back to Daniel's room without a word. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the edge of his bed, brushing his damp hair back, humming a lullaby I didn't recognize. The kind mother's hum from somewhere older than memory. It rained that night, not just the soft patter of passing clouds, but a steady, mournful downpour that clung to the windows like tears too shy to fall. I remember because it matched the heaviness in the air, the kind of night that presses on your chest, that makes you believe the veil between this world and the next is thinner than usual. And that was the night it happened. Angela had been whispering something over and over. I couldn't hear all of it, but I caught one sentence, sharp and aching. If a saint can touch my boy, please, come, please, come. She didn't say it like a demand. She said it like a surrender. Daniel, unconscious and pale, didn't stir. The machines continued their rhythm. The room remained unchanged, but something shifted. I can't explain it, not in the way doctors need charts or skeptics need evidence, but the air itself seemed to inhale. The lights flickered, only for a second, maybe even less, and then it passed. Angela never looked up. Her eyes stayed fixed on Daniel, tears running silently down her cheeks. Her hand never stopped moving through the rosary. I stepped into the hallway again. It was empty, except for the shadow of something that wasn't there. Something watching, not cruel, not kind either, just present, as if the hospital, for all its cold machinery, had noticed our prayers. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The nurses came and went. The rain fell. The crucifix above the nurses' station seemed to glisten slightly in the hallway light. Maybe it was the rain on the windows. Maybe it was something else. In the morning, everything changed. Daniel opened his eyes, not just fluttered them, not just half blinks. He opened them wide and looked straight at his mother with clarity. And then he smiled. It was the first time I had seen that smile in weeks. Angela gasped and dropped the rosary. Her hands flew to his face, cradling his cheeks as if afraid he might disappear. "Hi, Mommy," Daniel whispered. Her tears came fast and hard. The nurses rushed in. One of them nearly dropped her clipboard. Vital signs were taken. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen, all stronger than the night before. Much stronger. Impossible, they said, but Daniel didn't talk about his body. He talked about the dream. That would come later. For now, he just said, "I'm not cold anymore." Angela kissed his forehead again and again, whispering thanks to Jesus, to Mary, to every saint in heaven. I watched her, and for the first time, I understood what she meant about surrender, about the hem of his robe. I looked back at the crucifix. I could have sworn the wood looked warmer somehow. Not everything can be measured. Not everything needs to be. Some nights in the waiting room of silence, something holy listens back. And sometimes, it answers. Chapter 2. The Man in the Brown Robe. I remember the stillness before it began. The way Daniel's breath had slowed. The way his fingers twitched faintly against the white bedsheets. He was in a medicated sleep. They told me, a necessary rest to calm the pain, to allow his body to conserve whatever strength it had left. But I knew, somehow, that his soul was elsewhere. It had taken days for the doctors to stabilize him. The treatment had left his body weary, his immune system nearly non-existent. When they administered the stronger pain medication that night, they said he might sleep for a while, hours, maybe even a full day. But I watched him sink into something deeper than sleep. Angela didn't leave his side, her hand wrapped tightly around his, her lips moving constantly in prayer. The rosary never left her fingers. Her eyes, red from tears, never blinked long. I stood in the corner, helpless. I had nothing left to offer except presence. Then came the moment I can only describe as a hush, a quiet so profound that even the machines in the room seemed to muffle themselves. And Daniel began to dream. He told us everything later, in that breathless way children recount their secrets, like the story had been waiting to pour out of him the moment his lips could form it. In his dream, he was standing in the middle of an old church, not the one we attended, not any church he'd ever seen before. It was enormous, its stone walls towering toward a vaulted ceiling covered in dusky murals of angels and stars. The air smelled of beeswax and ancient incense. Light streamed in from tall stained glass windows, casting long patterns of blue, gold, and rose across the checkered floor. Candles, so many candles, their flames flickered gently in rows upon rows, casting a soft glow that seemed to move with him, as if they were alive. Daniel walked slowly down the aisle. His feet were bare, but he said the marble beneath him was warm. Not just warm, comforting, like it had been waiting for him. There were no pews, no congregation, no sound at all, just the quiet creak of his steps and the glow of holy fire. Then he saw the man. He stood near the altar, facing away at first. His robe was brown, the fabric rough and old, tied at the waist with a rope. His hair was short and silver, his back slightly bent with age. In one hand, he held a wooden rosary, the beads worn smooth with use. The other hand rested gently on the edge of the altar, as if in deep thought or prayer. Daniel stopped. He didn't know why. He said something inside him felt still, like when you hold your breath before something important happens. The man turned. He had the kind of face you never forget. Deep lines carved into skin like riverbeds. A soft white beard framing a mouth that looked like it had smiled more often than it hadn't. But it was his eyes Daniel remembered most. They were like looking into a candle, he told us later. Warm, but bright, like they could see everything and still liked what they saw. The man didn't speak at first. He walked toward Daniel, slowly, quietly. His steps made no sound on the marble. As he approached, Daniel said he felt something stir inside him. Not fear, never fear, but a feeling he couldn't name. Like he was being remembered. When the man reached him, he knelt, gently, reverently. He placed his hand on Daniel's forehead. His palm was rough, warm, and carried a faint scent, roses, wild roses, blooming in the heat of summer. Daniel said the scent made him want to cry, even though he didn't know why. Then, finally, the man spoke, only one sentence, just a whisper, "May the Lord be with you, my child." And in that moment, light, not from the candles, not from the stained glass, but from everywhere. Daniel said the church filled with it, like the walls themselves were shining. He couldn't see the ceiling anymore. He couldn't see the floor. Just light, soft, golden, and so full of love it almost hurt. He felt it flow into him, not over him, not around him, but into him, into the deepest parts of his body. The places that ached, the places that had been tired for so long. The light touched them all, and they healed. It felt like being hugged by heaven. He said, like being made new. When Daniel woke up, he was different. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't sit bolt upright and gasp. He simply opened his eyes, calmly, and looked at Angela. He touched me. He whispered. Angela froze. Who, baby? The man in the brown robe. He said, "May the Lord be with you." And then the light came. I was standing near the window when he said it. I turned around so fast I nearly dropped my coffee. Angela leaned in, brushing hair from his forehead. What did he look like? Daniel described him. The robe, the rosary, the silver hair, the scent of roses. Angela went pale. Later that day, Father Luca came to visit. When Angela told him the story, he grew very still. He pulled a small book from his coat pocket and flipped through the pages until he reached an image. He handed it to Daniel. "Do you recognize anyone here?" he asked, careful not to lead him. Daniel didn't hesitate. His little finger tapped one of the photographs. "That's him. That's the man." It was a picture of Padre Pio. Angela covered her mouth. Father Luca crossed himself. "He's a saint now," he said softly. "But when he was alive, people said he appeared to those in need, that his prayers could bring healing." Daniel smiled. He didn't feel far away. I didn't know what to say. I'd always believed in God. Yes, but saints, miracles, they were beautiful stories, but distant ones. Now, they had a face, a touch, a scent of roses lingering in a hospital room. That night, when the lights dimmed and the machines hummed softly, I found myself sitting beside the window, watching the sky turn from blue to indigo, and I whispered into the quiet, "If this is real, thank you." Something warm stirred in my chest. I looked over at Daniel, already drifting back to sleep, his face peaceful for the first time in months. And I believed, because that night, in the space between sickness and silence, a saint had walked through the veil and placed his hand on a dying child. And the light had come. Chapter 3. Tell me about him. It began with a glass of water. Daniel had been sleeping again, though this time not from medication. Just rest, real, gentle, healing rest. His breathing had softened. His color returned just enough to make Angela weep with gratitude. When he stirred that morning, the sun was just breaking through the east window of the hospital room, painting his blankets in a soft amber glow. Angela leaned in immediately, her hands fluttering as if unsure whether to hold him or simply hover in reverence. "Are you thirsty, sweetheart?" He nodded. It was so simple, so mundane. But when he took the glass and drank, steady and calm, it was as though the past few months had unraveled like a bad dream. The boy who could barely lift his head, whose skin had turned paper pale, now reached for the cup with a clarity in his eyes that none of us had seen in what felt like lifetimes. Angela could hardly contain herself. "Daniel, baby, how do you feel?" "Better," he said, in that small voice of his. But there was strength in it now. I dreamed of someone. I was seated near the radiator, trying to stay out of the way, notebook forgotten in my lap. Angela brushed back his hair, trying to smile through tears. Who did you see? Daniel blinked, as if gathering the memory like fragments of glass. He was old, kind eyes. Wore brown, not like a suit, more like a robe. And he had this rope around his waist. Angela's hand stilled. He said something to me. What did he say? Daniel's lips moved slowly, repeating the words like a prayer he'd known forever. May the Lord be with you, my child. The room went still. Even the machines seemed to quiet. Angela's fingers slipped into his, trembling. Can you tell me more about him? What he looked like? Daniel nodded. He had a beard, white, not too long. His face was soft, but old. He had eyes like warm light. He smiled without showing teeth. Just a little, like he knew me, and he smelled like flowers. Angela whispered, flowers, roses, but wild, not the kind in vases. The kind that grow where no one expects them. I had never heard Daniel speak this way, not even before the illness. There was a cadence to his words now, soft, reverent, as though something sacred clung to his memory. Angela kissed his forehead, trying to hide her tears. But Daniel wasn't finished. He was holding a rosary. He said, eyes distant, made of wood, not shiny, like it had been held a lot. Angela went very still. I saw her close her eyes. Just for a moment, her lips barely moving. She was praying, not like before, not the desperate, whispered petitions of a mother on the edge. This was something different. She was listening. That afternoon, after Daniel had fallen asleep again, Angela asked me to drive her to the rectory. Father Luca welcomed us in with his usual calm presence. He had been the parish priest for over 20 years, a quiet man who carried the weight of grief and joy in equal measure. His hands were always folded in front of him, as though perpetually mid-prayer. Angela told him the story in full, voice steady but quiet. She described Daniel's dream, his words, the scent of roses. When she mentioned the man's clothing, a brown robe with a cord belt, Luca's brow furrowed. There is someone, he said, rising from his desk and moving to a bookshelf lined with dusty tomes and framed relics. He pulled out a weathered binder, the kind parishes used for generations to keep images of saints. Flipping through its thick laminated pages, he stopped and turned the book toward us. Would you be willing to let Daniel look through these? Without prompting, Angela nodded. He'll know. We returned the next morning. Daniel sat upright in bed now, a miracle in itself. He took the binder from Angela's hands and opened it slowly, the pages heavy in his small fingers. He looked at each saint, Saint Francis, Saint Anthony, Saint Therese, without comment. And then he stopped. His hand pressed lightly on one of the photographs, a black and white image of a man with a full beard, kind eyes, and a Franciscan robe. The caption read, Saint Padre Pio. That's him, Daniel said, pointing. That's the man who touched me. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Father Luca, who had turned pale. Daniel, the priest asked gently, have you ever heard of Padre Pio before? The boy shook his head. No, but I know him. He knows me. I felt the air shift again. That subtle, sacred stillness that seemed to follow Daniel now like a second shadow. Luca sat back down slowly. "Do you know what this means?" he asked Angela. Though I think we all did. Padre Pio had died decades ago. He had been canonized in 2002, long before Daniel was born. And yet here he was, described in perfect detail by a child who had never seen his image, never heard his name, never been taught his story. Angela took her son's hand. Her voice was a whisper. "Tell me more about him. What did he do?" Daniel shrugged. "A child again." He looked at me. That was enough. The priest closed the binder with quiet reverence. He said nothing more. Angela sat beside Daniel that night and prayed aloud. Not the rote prayers of before, but a real conversation. Gratitude poured from her like light through stained glass. Daniel fell asleep smiling. I stayed awake longer, listening to the wind tapping against the window. Somewhere beyond that glass, a saint had walked through a dream, and a child had been changed forever. Chapter 4. The Name I Never Knew. Angela didn't sleep that night. After Daniel pointed to the photograph of Padre Pio, after he spoke with a certainty that both comforted and unnerved us. She sat beside his bed for hours. I watched her trace the edges of the image Father Luca had left behind, a simple print of the saint's serene, bearded face, with eyes that held both sorrow and grace. She kept whispering the name to herself. Padre Pio. It was a name she had never spoken before. Not aloud, not even in prayer. I remember her telling me once that she kept the saints simple in their household. Street Joseph, the Virgin Mary, the Archangel Michael. Nothing too complex, especially for Daniel's sake. And yet here was this boy, her boy, naming a man he had never seen, describing his robes, his scent, his hands. That night, when the machines beeped in their usual rhythm and the hospital lights dimmed, Angela turned to me and said, "We've never had a picture of him. Not in the house, not in any of Daniel's books." "You're sure?" She nodded slowly. "We don't even have a single Capuchin saint on display. I wouldn't have known who he was myself if Father Luca hadn't shown me." I believed her. I had known Angela for years. She was meticulous about her faith, and even more so about what touched her son's world. The idea that Daniel had somehow invented all this on his own, it was unthinkable. The next day, Dr. Green arrived earlier than usual. His white coat looked more wrinkled than normal, his eyes a bit more curious than clinical. He asked if he could speak just privately. Angela nodded and stepped into the hallway with him. I stayed behind with Daniel, who was quietly sketching with the crayons someone had brought. When Angela returned, she looked shaken. "What did he say?" I asked. She hesitated, then sat down. He said Daniel's results are inexplicable, in a good way or a bad way. He said it's not about good or bad. It's about things not adding up. His blood work is improving, white cell count stabilizing. The scans show no progression. He said, "In all honesty, Mrs. Varela, it's as if your son's immune system turned itself back on." I looked at her in silence. There were no words. He used the word remarkable, but then he said unscientific, as if those two things can't live in the same breath. We sat with that for a while. Daniel, unaware of the conversation, kept drawing. He used browns and reds, filling in the robe of a small figure standing before a background of tall stained glass. His fingers moved with quiet purpose. That night, during bedtime, he spoke again of the dream. It had returned to him, not all of it, but pieces he had read on his hands. Daniel said softly, curled under his blanket, "Not blood, not like a cut, just spots, circles, one on each palm." Angela froze. Did it hurt him? She asked gently. Daniel shook his head. No. He smiled, like it was okay, like he wasn't afraid of it. "And you could smell something, too?" He nodded. The roses again, but stronger this time. They were everywhere, even though there weren't any flowers. Angela got up quietly and stepped into the hallway. I followed her. "Do you know what that means?" she whispered. I had a feeling, but I let her speak. "The wounds, those are called the stigmata, right? When someone bears the marks of Christ. Padre Pio had them. I looked it up while you sat with Daniel. And the roses. Multiple accounts say his presence is often accompanied by the smell of flowers, even when none are nearby." She swallowed hard, as if saying it aloud made it more real. He couldn't have made that up. Daniel wouldn't know any of that, not unless. She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she spent the next few days reading everything she could about Padre Pio. She borrowed books from the hospital chaplain, scoured Catholic websites, and listened to old recordings of testimonies from people who had claimed to see him. Even after his death, some described visions, others dreams. Always the same notes: the brown robe, the quiet voice, the scent of roses, the warmth. All of it echoed Daniel's story. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to improve. He began to eat full meals again. His appetite returned slowly, then with vigor. His cheeks grew less hollow, his laughter more frequent. The nurses would pause outside the door, listening to the sound of a child telling stories, giggling, asking for puzzles. The boy who had once stared into the void now looked outward with curiosity again. Even the doctors couldn't explain it. They ran tests daily. Every result brought more confusion. The charts said he shouldn't be doing this well, but he was. Angela, of course, didn't need the charts. She kept Padre Pio's photo beside Daniel's bed, nestled into the corner of the monitor. At night, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, followed by another. "If you're still near him, thank you. Please stay." Sometimes, I swore I could smell roses too. Not strong, not overbearing, just a breath, a whisper. One evening, as the sunset poured orange and gold through the window, I turned to Angela. "Do you believe he really came? That it wasn't just a dream?" She looked at me, eyes shining. "I don't believe," she said. "I know." And in that room, wrapped in soft light and quiet wonder, I think I began to know too. The name Daniel had never heard, had somehow always known. Chapter 5. A Healing Beyond Science. They ran the tests again. Every one of them. Blood work, bone marrow biopsy, imaging scans, urinalysis. Even the nurses whispered that they had never seen the doctors order such an exhaustive series of diagnostics so quickly. But the results were unanimous. There was nothing, no trace of the cancer that had been eating away at Daniel's body for the better part of a year. No shadows on the scans, no abnormal blood counts, no signs of metastasis. It was as if it had simply vanished, wiped away like chalk from a blackboard. I remember the silence in the room when Dr. Green delivered the results. He stood near the window, his lab coat unusually still, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. The folder in his hand hung open, papers trembling slightly from the air vent above. But his voice, usually crisp, efficient, almost mechanical, was unsure. "This," he said, barely above a whisper, "I cannot explain." Angela sat beside Daniel's bed, one arm curled protectively around him. Daniel was playing with a small plastic rosary someone had given him. He wasn't paying attention to the doctor's words, only humming quietly to himself. Dr. Green cleared his throat. It's not unheard of for certain cases to go into spontaneous remission. But in children, and with this type of cancer, it's extraordinarily rare. He looked at me then. Extraordinarily. Angela didn't speak. Her eyes were soft, but filled with the kind of strength I hadn't seen since the diagnosis. Not defiant, simply certain. "We believe," she said quietly. Dr. Green didn't argue. For the first time, I think he realized there was no use. Later that evening, Angela took out a small journal from her bag. It was leather-bound, worn at the edges. I hadn't seen it before. "I've been writing it all down," she said, "since the day he slipped into the coma. Every prayer, every strange moment, every word Daniel said after he woke up." She opened it carefully and showed me a page. June 3rd. He smiled today in his sleep, whispered something I couldn't understand. Light flickered, just for a second. Was that real? June 5th. Daniel said he saw a man in brown. He said the man touched his head. I felt warmth in the room when he said it. June 9th. His vitals are improving. The doctors look confused. I am not. I read through the pages, feeling the thread of faith that wove itself through each line. Angela hadn't written as a mother desperate to record a miracle, but as a woman documenting something sacred. There was no dramatizing, no embellishment, just truth, as she saw and lived it. Word began to spread. It started with the hospital staff. One of the nurses, a quiet Catholic woman named Maria, asked if she could bring a small group from her parish to pray in the waiting area. Angela agreed. The next day, 3 women arrived, rosaries in hand. They sat in the corner chairs and began to recite the Divine Mercy Chaplet in soft, reverent tones. Daniel watched them from his bed. They sound like the wind in the church. He whispered to me. I didn't understand what he meant, but it sounded beautiful. Within a week, the hallway outside Daniel's room became a small chapel of sorts. Candles, battery operated, of course, flickered on the window ledge. Cards, holy medals, and small statues of saints appeared on the table near the nurse's station. Father Luca came every evening with communion and led quiet prayers. It was never loud, never invasive, just present. One morning, a local Catholic paper ran a small piece titled, "Boys' Recovery Baffles Doctors. Inspires Faith." They had interviewed Father Luca and Angela, though they kept Daniel's last name private. After the article ran, more visitors came. Some left prayer cards. Others knelt outside the door just to offer a moment of thanks. A few left in tears. Dr. Green tried to avoid them. I watched him pass by one morning, his eyes darting between the praying women and Daniel's door. He didn't stop, but he didn't scowl either. He looked humbled, or maybe unsure of who he was in a place where science had seemingly stepped aside. Daniel never acted surprised by the attention. He accepted it all with a strange peace. He was no longer frightened, no longer in pain, but more than that, he seemed anchored, like something within him had changed. One afternoon, while Angela stepped out to call her sister, I sat with him by the window. He was looking out at the sky, soft clouds drifting lazily across a pale blue canvas. "Are you happy?" I asked. He nodded. "Do you remember everything from the dream?" He thought for a moment. "Not all of it, just how it felt." "And how did it feel?" He turned to me then, and I'll never forget the way he said it. I wasn't scared anymore, because he touched me, and I knew that even if I died, it would be okay. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What do you say to a child who speaks like a prophet? Angela returned, and Daniel asked for a grilled cheese sandwich. He ate the entire thing. That night, as the sky deepened into twilight, I stepped outside the hospital for some air. The parking lot was half empty, the breeze cool against my face. And I thought of the moment Dr. Green had spoken those words. "This, I cannot explain." I realized then that maybe that was the point. Some healings aren't meant to be explained. Some moments are meant to remain wrapped in mystery, not to be solved, but to be honored. I looked up at the stars just beginning to pierce the dusk, and I whispered a thank you, not to science, not even to a name, but to the hand that had touched a dying child and made him whole. Chapter 6. Letters to Heaven. Daniel began writing letters to heaven 2 weeks after he was declared cancer-free. He asked for a pencil and a stack of paper, and Angela, without question, handed him a small yellow notebook and a box of colored pencils. He chose the brown one first. I watched him from the corner of the room, seated by the window as the late spring light poured through the glass. His handwriting was crooked and uncertain, the way most 8-year-olds write, but his words were deliberate. "Dear Mr. Brown Robe," the first letter began. He didn't call him Padre Pio at first. It wasn't that he didn't know the name by now, he did. But to Daniel, he wasn't a saint in stained glass or a face in a holy card. He was simply the man who touched his head and made the fear go away. He placed the folded paper next to the photograph Angela had taped to the corner of the bed's headboard. It was a small, grainy print, Padre Pio in his old Capuchin habit, hands tucked into sleeves, his eyes somewhere far beyond the frame. The next day, he wrote another. "Thank you for making me not scared. I still don't know how you came into the church. I don't remember the door, but I remember your eyes. You knew me." Angela didn't read them unless he asked her to. She respected the sacredness of them. Each morning, he would place a new letter beside the photograph, and each evening she would take it, fold it into an envelope, and tuck it into the old Bible beside her hospital chair. Word of Daniel's recovery continued to ripple outward. One afternoon, A man arrived at the hospital wearing a simple brown robe and sandals. With a large wooden rosary hanging from his belt, his name was Father Matteo, a Capuchin priest from a nearby monastery. He had read the newspaper article, the one about the boy whose cancer disappeared and whose first words were about a saint he had never known. Angela greeted him with a quiet grace, her voice soft. Daniel looked up from his drawing and smiled immediately. "You wear the same robe," he said. Father Matteo knelt beside him. "Yes, I belong to the same order as the man you saw, Padre Pio," Daniel said confidently. The priest's eyes glistened. "You know his name now." Daniel nodded. "But I still call him Mr. Brown Robe when I write to him. I think he likes that." Father Matteo stayed for hours. He listened to Daniel's story with reverent silence. And when it was done, he shared stories of his own, testimonies from others around the world who claimed to have seen Padre Pio in dreams. In moments of pain, in the final hours of life. Some say he still walks where he is needed. Father Matteo said, "We don't know how, but we believe." Daniel offered him one of his letters. "Can you take this to your church? I think he'll hear it better if it's closer to his house." Father Matteo promised he would, and he did. A week later, he sent a photograph of the letter placed in front of a large statue of Padre Pio at the monastery chapel. Daniel stared at the picture for a long time. Then he smiled. The story began to take on a life of its own. The local Catholic paper ran a follow-up. This time, it included Angela's journal entries and a photo of Daniel seated beside his bed, smiling and holding one of his letters. The headline read, "Letters to Heaven, a boy's journey from fear to faith." Soon after, a national religious magazine picked up the story. Interviews were requested. Angela declined most of them, wanting to keep Daniel's world small and sacred. But one local reporter, a woman named Elise who had lost her own son to leukemia years before, was invited in. She didn't ask clinical questions. She asked about Daniel's smile, about the moment Angela stopped being afraid, about the scent of roses. The article she wrote was more testimony than report, and when it was published, people responded. Letters arrived at the hospital addressed to Daniel. Some were from other children, some from elderly women who said they had once prayed to Padre Pio in secret. Others from strangers who said they had long since given up on faith until now. A retired man sent a small wooden crucifix he had carved himself. A nun from Ireland sent a relic medal of Padre Pio. A woman from South America sent a letter saying, "I haven't spoken to God in 20 years. Your son made me try again." Angela wept when she read that one. Soon, the little community at the hospital turned into something larger. The chapel, once empty and echoing, began to fill in the evenings. Nurses came on their breaks to light candles. Families of other patients gathered, and every night at 8 p.m., without anyone planning it, people began praying the chaplet of Padre Pio together. Daniel insisted on leading it the first time. His voice was quiet, but strong. The doctors still performed checkups. They still took his blood pressure and weighed him every morning. But even Dr. Green had stopped asking questions. One day, as he stood at the door, watching Daniel laugh with Father Matteo, he said to me, "There are different kinds of healing. Not all of them are cellular. He left before I could respond. I believed him. Angela's faith deepened. She didn't become louder, only steadier. Her prayers were no longer pleas, but conversations. Gratitude became her second language. And Daniel, well, Daniel kept writing. He never expected replies. He just needed to say thank you. To the man in the brown robe. To heaven. To whoever had heard their cry in the silence and answered with a touch. And every night, before sleep, he would whisper, "I hope you got my letter. If not, I'll write again tomorrow." Somehow, we all knew that he did. Chapter 7. The Signature of a Saint. Daniel's strength returned as if someone had poured light into his bones. Within weeks, he was no longer the pale, trembling child confined to a bed. He walked the halls of the hospital again, first with help, then alone. His laughter echoed from the walls like a bell, calling us back to something sacred. The nurses called him a miracle. The doctors still called him a mystery. But to me, he was something else entirely, a living signature of grace. One afternoon, Daniel and I sat under the tree outside the hospital garden. The sky was soft with spring clouds, and the wind carried the scent of fresh blossoms. He turned to me, serious. "I think I want to be a priest when I grow up." I smiled. "Why's that?" "Because I want to help people feel what I felt. I want them to know that they're not alone, even if they think they are." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You'd make a very good priest." Daniel, Angela heard him say it too. Later that evening, she wrote it in her journal. Today, Daniel said he wants to serve God with his whole life. I believe he already has. The news of Daniel's case reached further than any of us had expected. Dr. Green, ever the rationalist, ever the quiet observer, did something none of us could have predicted. He wrote a formal letter, not to another hospital, not to a research journal, but to the Vatican. He addressed it to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. In it, he detailed Daniel's medical history, the aggressive progression of his illness, the complete lack of positive response to standard treatment, and then the sudden and unexplainable remission following the child's dream of Padre Pio. He ended the letter with these words: "As a physician trained in empirical science, I am unable to find any explanation for this recovery that aligns with the protocols or expectations of medical treatment. I leave the rest to your discernment, but I believe something beyond my understanding has occurred here." Angela cried when she read it. We never heard back from Rome, not formally, but something in the act of the letter being sent felt like an acknowledgement, a small offering of truth to the larger mystery. Angela had always wanted to go to San Giovanni Rotondo, the town in southern Italy where Padre Pio had lived, served, and been buried. For years, it had been a name on the pages of other people's pilgrimages. Now, it was a destination that called her like a whisper. She booked the ticket 6 months after Daniel was declared fully recovered. It was a quiet journey. She went alone. Daniel stayed with his aunt, and I stayed with them both, watching over the boy who had once been more shadow than skin. Angela arrived in Italy just as the sun was rising. She said the air smelled different there, not sweet, not bitter, just old, as though time had slowed and made room for something holy. San Giovanni Rotondo was not a place of spectacle. It was quiet, humble. The church where Padre Pio had once prayed still stood, simple and worn. The larger sanctuary built in his honor stood nearby, a grand, sweeping structure of stone and glass. Filled with light, Angela didn't rush. She walked the corridors he had once walked. She sat in the confessional where he had listened to countless souls. She lit a candle near his tomb and whispered Daniel's name. But it was in the old chapel, the one barely changed since the days of Padre Pio, that it happened. She sat alone on a wooden pew, her hands wrapped around her rosary, her heart full, and as she bowed her head, she looked up and saw the painting. It was not grand, not even large, just a faded fresco above the altar, a figure of Christ with a child standing before him, and beside them, a man in a brown robe, one hand raised in blessing, the other placed gently on the child's head. Angela froze. It was the scene Daniel had described. Every detail, the soft candlelight, the robe tied with rope, the tender expression, the scent of roses in the air so faint it could have been memory. It was all there. She felt her knees weaken. She sat down, tears already rising, and then, through trembling lips, she whispered, "Thank you for touching my son." No one else was in the chapel. No one heard the words. But Angela felt the warmth on her shoulder, like a hand, resting lightly, only for a moment, and then it was gone. She stayed in Italy for 3 more days. She brought home a small relic medal, a vial of blessed oil, and a photo of the chapel fresco. She placed all of it on Daniel's bedside table. He looked at the photo and smiled. "That's the place," he said. "I remember the light." Angela kissed his forehead and held him close. Sometimes, miracles leave behind no thunder, no applause, just a fingerprint, a whisper, a single moment where heaven meets earth and leaves its mark. And in the quiet heart of a child, that mark remains forever, the signature of a saint. One year later, the sunlight through our kitchen window still feels like a benediction. Daniel sits at the table now with a lunchbox covered in superhero stickers. His backpack slung over the back of his chair. His cheeks are full again. His laughter frequent. There's a scab on his knee from playing tag during recess. He shows it off like a trophy. Sometimes I watch him when he's not looking, not because I doubt the miracle, but because I never want to forget what grace looks like when it walks around wearing sneakers and carries peanut butter sandwiches. He started school again last fall. The teachers knew his story, though none of them brought it up in front of the class. Still, there was something reverent in the way they watched him, like they were afraid to break the spell. But Daniel made it easy for them. He was just a kid again. Mostly, every night, before bed, he kneels beside his bed and prays. The small photograph of Padre Pio sits in a wooden frame beside his nightlight. It's the same one Angela taped above his hospital bed, now smoothed and preserved beneath glass. Sometimes, he talks to it like a friend, not with ceremony, just a soft, "Thanks for today," or "Hope you're still praying up there." Angela and I don't interfere. We just listen. She still writes in her journal. Her entries are quieter now, less filled with ache, more with gratitude. She writes about Daniel's jokes, the way he waves to strangers, The time he stopped in the middle of the grocery store because he thought he smelled roses. There weren't any flowers nearby. He still writes letters sometimes. Not every day, but enough. We find them tucked into the pages of books, under his pillow, once even in the mailbox. Always addressed to Mr. Brown Robe. Daniel told us recently that he doesn't remember every detail anymore. The dream has faded, like all dreams do. The chapel, the voice, even the scent of roses. But one thing remains, the touch. I don't remember everything, he said one night as we tucked him into bed, but I'll never forget how it felt when he touched my head. I wasn't alone anymore. I left his room in silence that night and stood in the hallway with Angela. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We knew, because miracles don't always come with trumpets. Sometimes they come quietly. They rest a hand on a child's forehead and whisper peace into the marrow of his bones. And sometimes, the greatest act of healing isn't the disappearance of disease, but the absence of fear. Daniel carries no fear now, only light, only wonder. He walks into the world with open hands and an open heart, never questioning why he was chosen, never doubting that he was. And each time I watch him run across the yard, or see him kneel beside his bed, or hear him whisper to the photo on his nightstand, I am reminded the hand that touched him has never let go. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm chapter 147 verse 3. Some stories don't need to shout to be remembered. They whisper, like a prayer in the dark, like a hand gently resting on your shoulder when you need it most. Daniel's journey is not just about recovery. It's about grace and the quiet power of being seen, known, and loved, even from beyond the veil. In a world so full of noise, skepticism, and fear, it is these moments, soft, sacred, and unexplainable, that remind us heaven is closer than we think. If this story touched something in you, if you believe, like we do, that faith still has the power to heal, then subscribe to Fogman Stories, where real encounters with the divine still live on in the hearts of the faithful. And until we meet again, may you feel, even for a moment, the warmth of a hand you cannot see but will never forget. See you in the next story, and remember, you are never truly alone.